This film will discuss the impact that the Warnock Report of 1978 had on deaf education. An often silenced group, the deaf community have endured great hardships due to the legislation that wasn't designed with them in mind, but had a fundamental impact on their education and culture. In this documentary, I will speak to deaf educators about their views on the legacy of the Warnock Report and their experience of deaf education from the 1970s to today. Commissioned in 1972 by the then Education Secretary Margaret Thatcher, the report of the Committee of Inquiry into the Education of Handicapped Children and Young People was chaired by Mary Warnock and is now known colloquially as the Warnock Report. The report was the first comprehensive study into the special educational needs of children in the UK. It was completed in 1978, and a year later, Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister.
Plainclothes police out of a car behind her. And Mrs. Thatcher out onto the doorstep.
Citizen in a democracy. I know full well the responsibilities that await me as I enter the door of number 10, and I'll strive unceasingly to try to fulfill the trust and confidence that the British people have placed in me and the things in which I believe.
One aspect of the Act focused on the movement of the education of those with special educational needs or disabilities from specialist provisions and into mainstream schools. Before 1978, the majority of deaf children were educated in specialist deaf schools. This integration would mean the movement of deaf children into mainstream schools and the subsequent closure of many of these deaf schools. The mainstreaming was well-intentioned. The Warnock Report states, handicapped people should share the opportunities for self-fulfillment enjoyed by other people. Integration for the disabled means 1,000 things. It means the absence of segregation. It means social acceptance. It means being able to be treated like everybody else. Despite its good intentions, this integration of deaf children has been a failure, both in terms of educational attainment and access to deaf culture. This film seeks to listen to those who have been affected by Warnock and explore their views on deaf education, the school before Warnock, the school after Warnock, the impact of Warnock, and some recommendations for the future.
Yeah. So I'm Sandra Bent.
My name's Chris Wilton.
So my name is Hilary Sutherland.
I work at Elmfield School for Deaf Children.
And I obtained a PhD in bilingualism through the eyes of the child.
It's been a totally different type of teaching experience from anything I've had before. I used to teach in mainstream schools, and I hadn't really ever imagined I would teach in a deaf school.
Well, I was a lecturer at Bristol University in the Deaf Studies department, and my specialist sort of subjects were childhood acquisition and deaf education, and then kind of mostly looking at sort of children with BSL and how they use the language. So I've worked at a number of different universities. So I'm from a deaf family. My mum and dad were deaf, my sister, my brother, all deaf. My children are deaf. So I think we've got deaf family as far back as 1824. So yes, a very strong culturally deaf family.
There are 22 deaf schools in the UK. There are 44,000 deaf children. 78% of these deaf children are educated in a mainstream school. Sadly, less than half of all deaf children are attaining the required level of reading, writing and maths at Key Stage 2, compared to 3/4 of all hearing children and 44% of deaf children acquiring 2 A levels or equivalent, compared to 63% of hearing children.
Nobody's kind of looked at what's seriously gone wrong. And we know the Conran report that was say that, you know, said that deaf children have a reading age, by the time they leave school, they have a reading age of around 8 or 9. And even that still didn't spark a debate. You know, and then there was the expectation that cochlear implants would change everything, so it didn't matter. That didn't happen. Which sort of things that nobody's really thought about those priorities for deaf children and deaf education. But they're not failures. The system has failed them. That's the difference.
By no means was deaf schooling perfect before Warnock. Deaf children at these specialist schools were often in a very contradictory setting. Although great hubs of deaf culture and shared experience, these schools were often oral.
This is no ordinary school, and these no ordinary children. Each sits wrapped in a world of silence, for each was born deaf, and but for what they learn here would suffer dumbness as well. It is by sight and touch that they develop the gift of speech.
Because I can give you my family experience as well. So my family are hearing, and I was the only deaf child. So I went to a deaf school, grew up going to a deaf school in Plymouth. It's closed down now. Like you were saying, as so many other deaf schools have closed down, the deaf school in Plymouth closed down. But Plymouth was an oral deaf school and you weren't allowed to sign. But I still learned sign language from friends. We used to do it in secret. We used to put the desks up, sign behind the desks, and then put the desk back down. You know, sign language is a very powerful thing, isn't it? We had to learn to speak. That's what we were supposed to do. There was lots of speech lessons. That was the main thing. But my favorite subject was always sports.
Without this kind of teaching, she would grow up completely helpless, denied the twin gifts of hearing and speech. Now she develops the one and substitutes sight for the other, an achievement of which Britain may well be proud.
It was these schools that gave deaf children from hearing families the chance to meet other deaf children and form a sense of identity.
I also had a friend from my friend was from a deaf family, another friend from a deaf family. This friend knew so much. The friend that was from a deaf family knew so much more about everything than I did. And that's because, you know, my mum was really easy to lip read. But my mum and dad kind of didn't have that much conversation. You know, I sort of just grew up with that. Yeah, absolutely, definitely. And I think, you know, the deaf space is extremely important, especially if you don't have that at home either. I mean, you know, even when I went to school, I didn't have to worry. I had that language. I had BSL, I had friends. I didn't have to worry about, you know, having to behave appropriately to fit in with the hearing world. I mean, I can remember my mum would always say to me, when you go out to the shops or if you're on the bus, you have to keep your signs really small. Don't point, because hearing people think that's rude. When we were at home, we had our own signing style. It didn't matter if it was big, it didn't matter who we pointed at. But a lot of what we were told when we were going out is actually, you know, and like I said, when I was doing the decal research, we were researching about pointing and the use of fingers and pointing is so important in sign language. But I can remember so strongly my mum going, don't point, it's rude. Hearing people think it's rude and we use it to reference things, we use it all the time, but the fact that it's really, really rude meant that we had to be really careful. We had to adjust. We had to try and not do these things in the hearing world. But when it was within our own family, within a deaf space, it didn't matter. We could use our language how we wanted. We were free to and comfortable just to be ourselves. And and Deaf Club was exactly the same. We sort of just went to Deaf Club and was like, oh, this is just easy. And I would say a high percentage of us, might actually be with hearing people all day and wouldn't be able to be themselves, and they might be able to have these conversations like, oh, lovely weather, but actually would be working in these sort of hearing environments when they couldn't be themselves, they couldn't express themselves. And then when they went to a deaf club, it was like, oh, brilliant, I can just be myself. I've got my own language. And the deaf club became another home. What does the Warnock Report mean? I think you're right, that deaf people didn't have any say in anything, but the impact that it had, with a number of deaf schools that closed, so many deaf children then ended up being mainstreamed. And I'm not saying that that's an awful thing for everyone, but there were lots of deaf children who, probably would have done okay in mainstream. They had some hearing, they had fairly good speech, they coped. But that's the partially deaf children who can kind of fit in. What was great for me going to a deaf school was also, it was a residential school. And it meant that became my family. The deaf community actually, what we looked out for each other, we supported each other. And the confidence I had was quite overwhelming, actually. It was amazing just being in that environment.
For young deaf people that are going through a mainstream school system, yeah, perhaps they might well be losing something where they maybe don't feel as integrated into a deaf community.
Yeah, I think maybe, thinking again about this deaf space, when I was researching bilingual education, we were looking at what children were doing in the playground. So I would be observing them in school, and it might be maybe a hearing school with a deaf unit. And this, it could be either a PHU, those units that are attached to mainstream schools. And we were looking at that the deaf children spent a lot of time in the hearing classroom as opposed to being in the unit. So, I can see this, I'll add as well, I have deaf children and deaf grandchildren. So I've experienced this as a parent and a grandparent. So quite often what they're doing is being educated in the classroom with a support worker, but we were looking at what are they doing at playtime, and they were always playing with the other deaf children. And all of the research that we did into bilingual education saw that what was happening at the playtime was that they would play with their deaf friends. So it meant that in the classroom, it was okay for them to be in that sort of mainstream space. That's what their education was. But when they got to pick their time, they were with their deaf friends. When I arrived, I was a real introvert. And I don't think anyone will believe that, now, whereas I think actually I'm quite a confident person now. I'll go anywhere, I'll do anything. And that was about being in that school. And I think that was also down to the nurturing part of having the deaf community. That, was quite an influence. And I think that it sort of confirmed what I found in my research, that there's that having that part of the deaf community gives you a resilience. And it's about you know, the education in that environment also gives them additional tools that are broader than an education. It's about sort of, you know, living. And for an oral deaf person, the only method of communication they have is their speech or their or being able to lip read. And if someone doesn't understand their speech, they're absolutely stuck. And that is what erodes their confidence.
Really great for our mental health and emotional well-being if we have a real clear sense in who we are as people. So of course, for young deaf people, they need to have a clear sense of who they are, and that doesn't, and if there's a risk of that being kind of overlooked by the fact they're going into mainstream education, then that's something that absolutely that should not be overlooked. You clearly see that that's something that could well get overlooked.
So, and I think that's difficult. So my son is moving to Bristol, and he has been visiting lots and lots of different schools, but is really struggling to find somewhere to put his deaf children. And he hasn't found anywhere. He's gone, that's it. That's where they can go. Yeah. It should be Amfield. It's a school for deaf children, and he has deaf children, but their education is the same as hearing education, because that's the primary language that they have for the children at home. So I think parents are quite often torn about, I want that place, I want them in a deaf school, that's me, I'm deaf, I want them there. But actually it might not be the best place for a deaf child. So where do you put them? And I think a lot of parents are very torn with this decision at the moment. I think that's why a lot of families, you'll find a lot of families move all over the place, because what they're looking for is the right educational environment for their child. Parents with deaf children will move, will change jobs, will go all over the place trying to find somewhere. And I think it's about choices, where a deaf children, you know, the options for deaf children are very limited. And that would be my concern, because there are so many deaf schools that are closing, and all those little local deaf schools that are closing means actually it really limits children's choices. Mm. So I feel now that the deaf children are sort of pushed out to the units, and deaf children with additional needs are in the deaf schools. And I think that, you know, there's a place for Elmfield. It definitely has its place, but it isn't enough. It doesn't cater to all deaf children. And I think every parent has to think about what is best for their deaf child. You know, where can they cope? Where do they fit in? Which setting will actually challenge them, will give them a really grounding and healthy, happy education? That's the questions that you ask. What I would like to see for the future is all deaf children have an early years provision, but for all of them to be in one place where they can kind of have those ongoing assessments. And then at 6, 7 or 8, you can see, well, how well they're going to cope stepping out into something else, either mainstream. How would they cope in mainstream? How do they cope with lip reading? What about the use of interpreters? For me, I think up to 7 is where you can see where they might be going. I think it's also important that this process is child-led. There's some research that I found. They filmed the children and looked at how much signing they used compared to how much verbal communication they used. And that really helped them to plan for the child's future. And I'd quite like to see some more of that being looked at, that sort of thing. Actually, what's their natural communication? What are they choosing, and in which setting and in which environment are they choosing? And I would like to see environments that the children are in be half deaf staff, half hearing staff, a mixture of that sort of bilingual communication, and professionals working together, but with sort of deaf input as well. And then also there is the fact that we need deaf teachers. That's how it's done as well. Those that are native signers, that get the understanding of the subject right the way through. The confusion is, what is bilingual education? And deaf teachers, they know how to do it. They know how to teach the topic. They know how it is understood by deaf children, and it is understood in a different way. And then once you've got it in the base language, you can then put it into English. And I think you can only have a bilingual education if you understand what bilingualism is.
It seems that Warnock had good intentions. It recognised that education was about more than just knowledge. It was also about belonging. However, it seems the changes it instigated were made without listening to the deaf, and the many benefits of a shared deaf space were lost, without ever achieving an acceptable educational attainment.
It doesn't need to be like that. And I think the way that we can save education and the way that we can even save money is just by getting them all together. And then the parents will have some kind of starting point, so they know what to expect. And if all of the family can sign, then the child is at the heart of the family, and they are at the heart of everything. You know, and it's about them feeling like it's normal. It's about being in a normal home. Children want to know, what are my parents talking about? Are they arguing? Are they talking about this? You know, what's happening with everyone else in the family? Deaf children miss all of that. You know, and like you said about Hillary saying, you know, well, we used to ask all our deaf friends because they knew everything about the world. It's because hearing families didn't know how to communicate with their deaf children, explain things. They didn't get all of that stuff. And actually, most of that incidental learning that you get at home, that's the core of your education. And actually, for deaf people, we have to spend a lot of extra time working hard to understand what's going on. And it's exhausting. It's exhausting for them.